Okay, hello everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us in the 26th session in the Gerhart Center webinar series. This session will be led by a great speaker and thought leader, Paul Gorski. He will lead a discussion around why individualistic poverty approaches are not anti-poverty at all. As you know, we launched this series last April to discuss topics that are not mainstream, but with the COVID crisis hitting the globe and exposing lots of structural problems, we hope that they become mainstream in the near future. We are lucky to have a great speaker, and we are also lucky to have a great moderator as well. Today's session will be moderated by Mirai Nassim. Mirai is the CEO of the Takatuf Foundation. It's an NGO that works in the field of education. Mirai has over 19 years of experience in managing development projects. She capitalized on her previous experience as well as her network in the previous sector to serve this cause by mobilizing the business community to contribute to a national cause as part of its CSR and to pay back to community. In 2017, Mirai received the Top 50 Performing in Egypt award for the year 2016. Mirai is currently the co-chair of the Corporate Impact and Sustainability Committee of the American Chamber of Commerce. Without much to say, I will leave the floor for Mirai. She will introduce the speaker and kick off today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Kariman, for your generous introduction. Welcome, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, because of the difference of time zone. And first of all, I would like to apologize on behalf of Dr. Ali to Paul and to the attendees. He wanted so much to be here, but because of health issues, he's not able to join us. Paul, or Dr. Paul, but he prefers that I call him Paul Gorski. Thank you very much for taking the time and being with us today. Paul Gorski is a long-time educator, activist, and author whose work revolves around economic and racial justice. After a long career in academia, he founded the Equity Literacy Institute, actually a very interesting institution, an organization that works directly with schools and school districts on matters of equity and justice. Paul's books include Reaching and Teaching Students in Poverty and case studies on diversity and social justice education. He lives in the mountains of Appalachia in the United States. I believe that today he's going to give us the presentation and give us insight into his book, Reaching and Teaching Students in Poverty, and why individualistic anti-poverty approaches are not anti-poverty at all, focusing on three
Okay, well, the introduction, oh, you're back. You froze for a little bit, so we didn't get the end of that. Should I just go ahead and start? Oh, you're muted. Should I go ahead and start? I missed kind of the end of that introduction. You
yes, please, Paul, go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. It's such an honor to be able to share this space with you, even though it's electronic space instead of physical space. I'm always honored to be able to interact with people from different parts of the world who are passionate about some of the things that I'm passionate about. I want to tell a little story about how I ended up on this topic. For many years, about 25 years, my work has revolved around matters of equity and justice, anti-oppression, anti-discrimination, in education. And I've been all over the world, every continent except for Antarctica, working with schools and school districts on these issues. And in the 1990s, late 1990s, a book was published called A Framework for Understanding Poverty by a woman in the United States named Ruby Payne. And the book was based on an idea called the culture of poverty. And I wonder how many of you have heard that term, culture of poverty or mindset of poverty. And people were very excited about it, and somebody suggested that I get that book and read it. And I got the book and I read it, and to be honest, I was horrified by it. It was, to me, just a list of stereotypes about people experiencing poverty. And in essence, what the book was arguing, that the way to eliminate poverty is to fix or somehow adjust the mindsets of or cultures of people who are experiencing poverty. So I sort of, there was also a program called the Circles program that Ruby Payne was involved in. The Circles program, in essence, is this idea that in order to eliminate poverty in local communities, we find individual people who are experiencing poverty and we surround them with people who are middle class or wealthier so that they can learn the culture or mindset that it takes to be middle class. Well, the problem with that is that it is not possible to address poverty as an issue by fixing people experiencing poverty, and any more than we can eliminate sexism by helping women to adjust to the oppression that they experience as women. It's not possible. That, in fact, is the opposite of an equity and justice framework. So what I was curious about, so this person, Ruby Payne, wrote this book, and it became popular all over, especially the United States and Canada. And what I was curious about was, to me, the issue really wasn't Ruby Payne. This person can write whatever she wants, as inaccurate and oppressive as it is. The thing that confused me was why all of these people who were very well-intended, who cared about social issues, who worked in education, who worked in non-government organizations and nonprofit organizations, how did all of these people who were otherwise justice-minded look at this book and think, that sounds right? So what we're going to do for anti-poverty, we're not going to eliminate all the conditions that create poverty. Instead, what we're going to do is somehow change the people who are experiencing poverty. Well, changing people who are experiencing poverty does not all of a sudden create living wage jobs. It doesn't all of a sudden create access and opportunity. The levels of access and opportunity are the same. We're going through this interesting thing in the United States right now where there has been a push that kind of suggests everyone needs to go to college. Everyone should go to college. The problem is there aren't enough jobs that pay enough money that if everyone who goes to college has one of those jobs, they can even pay off their college loans. So the problem there is not that those people don't have, or something's wrong with their mindset or culture, so they can't pay off college. The problem is a structural problem about how access and opportunity are distributed and how the system is created to increase wealth at the top of the power structure at the expense of basically everyone else. And if we don't name that and try to fix that as a problem, then we're not actually doing anti-poverty work. So what I want to do is kind of talk through basically 3 understandings that people have about why poverty exists, and to talk about how 2 of those 3 understandings will always lead us to anti-poverty strategies that are never going to be a threat to poverty. So before I do that, I want to just say a little bit about the language I'm going to be using that I've already been using. Different scholars and activists have different ways of talking about different socioeconomic groups. I think the main thing I want to point out here is that, of course, it's a continuum. It's not that, there are some people who are working class, but pretty close to being middle class. There are other people who are working class who are, one health problem away from being in poverty. So it's a continuum. It's also very relative. What poverty means in different places are very different, and the cost of living in different places are very different. So, but the other thing I want to say, especially about what it means for somebody to be living in poverty, experiencing poverty, is that we have to differentiate access to material resources from other ways that people talk about poverty. Because often I'll talk about, like I define poverty, someone being in poverty, as someone who does not have access to the basic resources they need to meet basic needs: food, shelter, just basic human rights. So people who don't have the resources necessary to meet their those basic needs. Often when I say that, somebody else will say something like, well, I know people who grew up who are very poor, but who are spiritually rich, or who are emotionally rich. I said, well, great for them but spiritual richness does not get me health care. Spiritual richness does not pay for me to feed my kids. So I think it's great so the point here is, when we talk about people experiencing poverty, we're not assuming that they don't have other kinds of wealth in their lives: emotional wealth, spiritual wealth, great relationships. What we're talking about is the injustice in a world where the resources exist for nobody to be in poverty, where the resources exist for nobody to be in poverty, the injustice of that there are people who do not have access to just the most basic human rights. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about poverty. I also often use the term working class. I think of working class people as people who have just enough access to the resources necessary to meet their basic needs. So these are people who are not accumulating. So for people who are working class, losing income for a very short period of time lands them in poverty. What's interesting with COVID, at least in the United States and Canada, is that a lot of people who thought they were middle class and then lost their jobs because of COVID realized I wasn't middle class, because I lost my job and within a few weeks, all of a sudden I'm in debt. So working class are people who make just enough. Again, everyone doesn't agree on these definitions, but these are the definitions that I use. Working class people, just enough resources to meet basic needs. Middle class people, a middle class person has sufficient access to the resources necessary to meet basic needs, but also enough to save a little, to accumulate a little bit, so that I have a little protection if something happens. Then I think of managerial class. Generally, these are people who work in private industry or in the upper tier of high-paying professions, or sometimes these are people who run the organizations that are owned by wealthy people and corporations. generally people in the managerial class would be fine economically, even if their income stopped for a while because they've been able to accumulate enough. And then finally, wealthy people, generally wealthy people do not have to work because their existing wealth generates enough wealth for them to live on. That doesn't mean they don't work. I think most people who are wealthy actually do work. It doesn't mean that they don't work. But in most countries, wealthy people play a disproportionate role in policy development and political lobbying and those sorts of things. So even in places where, like in the US, we're very proud of claiming to the world that we are this democratic republic and everybody's vote counts. That's really not true in the sense that we have laws that allow wealthy people loopholes to donate basically as much money as they want to political candidates. And political candidates who don't have those kinds of lobbies generally have no chance of being elected, at least not to federal office. So if I look at this sort of through an equity lens, what I want to look at is how institutions or systems or structures like education, healthcare, and those sorts of things. Contribute to disadvantage for people who are working class and experiencing poverty. But I also want to look at how those same institutions advantage people who have economic resources. So sometimes when we talk about poverty, the focus can be on, the experiences of people experiencing poverty, but that's directly connected to the people who in part are accumulating their wealth off of the labor of people who are experiencing poverty. So we have to look at both of those as sort of two sides of the same coin. So that's just giving you a little framing of the language I'm going to use. So what I want to do now is just talk really quickly about these three, what I call poverty ideologies. This comes out of research that people were doing a few decades ago that they called poverty attribution theory. Poverty attribution theory. What they were interested in was to what explanations do people attribute the existence of poverty? So if I just said to you, why does poverty exist? Why does poverty exist? Your poverty ideology would be whatever comes to your mind quickest, whatever you believe about why poverty exists. Why does poverty exist? Now, usually what we have found, and again, I work in education, so you can actually even apply this to particular contexts. Like I might ask, why on average do students who are experiencing poverty not do as well in school as their wealthier peers? Why are they not as likely to attend college or graduate from college? Those sorts of things. So your ideology, your poverty ideology or your poverty attribution idea is really based on how you would answer these questions. How you would answer these questions. And what's really interesting I study mostly education and I'm based in the US, is that when people have done studies about what is the attribute that best predicts how well a teacher will do teaching students who are experiencing poverty, what they have found was that it's not about any kind of instructional strategy. It's not about any kind of experience, but it comes down to how I would answer this question. Why do students experiencing poverty not do as well in school? What they found was the best teachers for students experiencing poverty, if they were asked this question, their response would be, their impulse would be, well, think about the challenges and the barriers that people experiencing poverty face outside of school and in school. Think of lack of access to preventive health care. Think about lack of access to healthy food, lack of transportation, lack of, a house full of books and computers. And that it's got nothing to do with how hard they work. It's got nothing to do with how much they value education. It only has to do with access. It only has to do with access. The best teachers were the ones who are attuned to this really being about access. Who has access? Who has opportunity? What they found, so when they said, why do students experiencing poverty not do as well? The best teachers on average responded, well, they're facing a lot of barriers and challenges in their lives. They don't have access to the same things the wealthier students have access to. The teachers who turned out to be the worst teachers for students experiencing poverty, their response to this was, well, of course they don't do as well because they don't value education. They don't have good role models. Their parents aren't involved in their learning. All of their responses, in essence, were, what are the things we need to fix about people experiencing poverty? Very individualistic. What do we need to fix about people experiencing poverty? Not what are the barriers and challenges that research shows is actually the cause of these disparities, but what do we have to fix about people experiencing poverty? Now, this was interesting to me because I grew up, my mom's side of the family were very poor Appalachian coal miners. So, you know, this is my grandma, my mom's mom, Grandma Wilma, who is the most adorable thing ever, I have to say. But I would have, and some of you probably had adults in your life, and I can remember in school hearing things like, you can achieve whatever you want to achieve if you just work hard enough. That's a very popular sentiment in the United States, this kind of meritocracy sentiment. If you just work hard enough, you can achieve whatever you want. You know, if you really want to understand the issues of equity and justice, sometimes we have to challenge the ideas that we hold most dear. So I'm going to challenge this one for you and tell you that that statement is completely untrue. It is a lie that people can achieve whatever they want if they just work hard enough. That's just a lie. Some people, of course, who are born in poverty, come out of poverty. Some women overcome the experiences of sexism and patriarchy and end up in leadership positions and all of that sort of thing. But we all know that it's disproportionate. So if we buy into this notion that anyone can achieve whatever they want if they just work hard enough, then basically what we're saying is the problem with people experiencing poverty is that they do not work hard enough. And I could never understand this. My people were coal miners. My people were miners. Are you telling me they weren't working hard enough as coal miners? What they needed to do was work harder as coal miners? You know, they're spending 12 hours in the coal mines. You know, the men are dying in their 30s from lung disease. And you're telling me that the problem with them is that they're not working hard enough during those 12-hour workdays. It just doesn't make any sense if I look at it with any sort of clear lens. So the first thing we have to do if we want to address poverty in a real way is to move away from the models that say the way to eliminate poverty is to fix people experiencing poverty, that somehow they are the cause of poverty. Poverty is a big structural injustice in societies that have enough resources for there not to be anybody experiencing poverty, especially when wealth is so unequally distributed as it is in virtually every country in this world. So 3 poverty ideologies that I want to talk to you about. The first one is what I've been talking to you about. It's called deficit ideology. Somebody who has a deficit ideology believes that disparities like wealth disparity or income disparities are the results in deficiencies. And again, I'm working in education. That's why I'm referring to students here. And students and families experiencing poverty. So this is that whole culture of poverty, mindset of poverty. We have to change the cultures of people experiencing poverty. We have to change the mindsets of people experiencing poverty. But what we do when we become fixated on that is we ignore the injustices that resulted in the existence of the poverty to begin with. The barriers, the inequities, the biases, the stereotypes that actually influence the disparities. Again, I'm working in education, so I'm referring to educational disparities here. So usually when someone has a deficit ideology, they're ignoring all of the things that actually cause poverty or even require the existence of poverty. They ignore that and instead focus on fixing the cultures, mindsets, behaviors, resilience, and dispositions of people who are experiencing poverty. There is no possible way to eliminate poverty with that strategy, no possible way. And it's a very privileged and very oppressive way to go about poverty. Now, if we're addressing the conditions that create poverty, then doing things that sort of bolster people who are experiencing poverty with educational opportunities, that's fine, that's another thing. But to ignore the causes of poverty and then to say we're going to fix people experiencing poverty while we ignore the causes of poverty, that is the best possible way to contribute to the existence of poverty. All right, so that's deficit ideology. Grit ideology is becoming more popular. With grit ideology, we might acknowledge that people experiencing poverty cope with barriers, biases, challenges, inequities, structural kinds of barriers. But instead of removing or mitigating those barriers, the focus is on helping them overcome those barriers by being more gritty or being more resilient, you know, that sort of thing. This kind of reminds me, I was at one point I lived in a different part of the United States, and a local politician called me and said that they had noticed that in middle schools and schools in Minnesota, that they noticed there were growing issues with sexual assault happening, boys sexually assaulting girls in their schools. So they noticed that this was happening increasingly in Minnesota, the state in the northern part of the US. And they're trying to, and they said, we think we have a solution to this. And we would really like for you to support our solution because we think it will help us get momentum for our solution. So I said, well, what is your solution? And they said, well, what we're going to do is require that girls and young women take self-defense class as part of their school. So this is the same sort of grit mindset. We're not going to do anything about the problem of sexism, sexual assault. We're going to help girls and young women become more resilient against the sexual assault, which, by the way, they're probably going to need because we're not doing anything at all about the actual problem of sexual assault. This is that grit or resilience mindset, is that what we got to do is just help people who are being oppressed cope with their oppression better. Now, of course, I would say all of us could use some support and learning how to be resilient and overcoming challenges and barriers and all of that. But I also think, who is more gritty and resilient than the poorest, most marginalized people in this world? Who's more gritty and resilient already, just growing up having to learn how to survive through the racism or through the poverty or through the sexism and the threat of sexual assault or whatever it is? Who is more gritty and resilient than those people? So that's why this just never made sense to me. But to tell people who are being cheated out of equal access and opportunity that if you just are more gritty and resilient, then you can overcome this. Again, this is a way to avoid what the real issues are. So what we want to do is get to what's called a structural ideology. structural ideology. Structural ideology, again, I'm using education examples here, say that any kind of disparities, educational disparities, any kind of disparities are the result of inequities or gaps in access and opportunity. Gaps in access and opportunity. They're not gaps in morals. They're not gaps in effort. They're not, I mean, as a pattern, individually you might say, well, somebody works harder than somebody else. But as a pattern, there's no evidence that suggests that people experiencing poverty on average do not work just as hard as wealthy people. In fact, people experiencing poverty usually have the most laborious, labor-intensive, physically exhausting jobs. We could actually make the argument that on average they work harder than other people. So structural ideology is focus on addressing the inequities, the biases, the stereotypes, the oppressions that actually create gaps in access and opportunity. So again, if I'm working in an institution like a school, instead of saying, well, what do I need to fix about students experiencing poverty? My question is, what do I need to fix about this school so that it does not give out access and opportunity unequally based on the amount of resources somebody has to begin with? So the focus is on removing barriers, including inequitable policy, identifying and eliminating all the inequities. That's a structural ideology. So I want to give you just a quick sort of example of this. Another thing that I spent a lot of time working on is the issue of homelessness. The issue of homelessness. I always think about, in my community, what are the kinds of things people are doing to address the issue of homelessness? And when I make a list of those things, usually the list of things that they're doing are things that that actually are not a threat to the existence of homelessness. Usually they are things that help people who are homeless be a little bit more comfortable as people who are homeless. So maybe we collect clothes, maybe we offer temporary shelter, maybe we provide food to people who are homeless, but none of that addresses the problem of homelessness. In fact, all of those things leave the problem of homelessness untouched and focus on how do we just create some supports so that people who are homeless are a little less hungry and that sort of thing. So this is what happens when we get into that view that's not really that structural view. The question is, what are the causes of homelessness? What do we need to do to address those? And that gets me to the final thing that I want to talk about, which is really quickly just moving from what I call a mitigative approach to a transformative approach. So I'm going to share a couple parables that I think are pretty universal parables just to illustrate this. So some of you have probably heard the Starfish story. The Starfish story goes like this. There's a young girl on a beach, and she notices that there are thousands of starfish that have washed up on the beach and they're drying out and dying. So she's picking up the starfish one by one and throwing them back into the ocean. And an adult comes walking down the beach and says, "You're never going to make a difference. There are thousands of starfish. You're never going to make a difference." And the young girl picks up a starfish and she says, "Well, I made a difference to this one," and throws it back in the ocean. Now, that story makes me want to cry because I think it's such a beautiful story. But the problem is, so much of the focus on addressing poverty is draws on people's the same emotions that people have when they hear that story. If I can just help one person out of poverty, then I've done my part. Helping one person out of poverty is great. The problem is when we're working with limited resources, and another way to look at that is, well, let's say I help this person who's experiencing poverty get a job that pays enough of a wage that they're no longer in poverty. What that means is that somebody else is out of that job and now they're in poverty. So I haven't addressed the problem of poverty there. I've just reorganized the poverty, right? And that's what I call this sort of starfish approach. We help a small number of people experiencing poverty or children experiencing poverty without addressing the underlying question, which is, why do we have the poverty? So then there's this parable called the babies in the river parable. And I'm horrified by the notion of babies in a river. So instead I have adults floating on inner tubes in a fake river here. But anyway, so the babies in the river parable goes like this. There's a woman standing at the bank of a river, and she notices there's a baby floating down the river. So she swims out and saves the baby, puts the baby in the grass. When she turns around, there's another baby floating down the river. She swims out, saves the baby, puts the baby in the grass. The more time she does this, the more babies are floating down the river. Next thing you know, the whole village is down by the river and everybody is swimming out, saving babies, putting them in the grass. And then that first woman starts to walk up the river. She leaves the people saving the babies, starts to walk up the river, and everybody is furious. Where are you going? We have to save the babies. And she says, I'm going to go find out how all these babies keep ending up in the river. Which, by the way, is the only way to solve that problem. But often what we do out of our good intentions is we spend our whole lives pulling babies from the river, and whoever is benefiting from the babies being in the river is thrilled that that's how we're responding to this problem, and that nobody's going and finding out how do these babies keep ending up in the river. So that's that shift from mitigative, save the babies from the river, to transformative. Now, I want to say just as a last thing here, and this is my contact information if anybody wants it, and then we'll open it up to questions. Just the last thing I want to say here. The truth is we need both of these. We need mitigative and transformative happening. We don't want people who are experiencing poverty to starve to death while we're trying to figure out the bigger structural things that need to happen. So we need both of these things happening at the same time. The problem is usually both of these things are not happening. Usually 99.9% of the effort is going into pulling babies from the river, throwing starfish back in the ocean, and very little percent is going to actually transforming the conditions that resulted in the starfish drying out or the babies being in the river. And in fact, those of us who are walking up the river and trying to address the root of the problems, we get targeted with very harsh scorn for doing that. We're called we're called unpatriotic. We're called, radicals. And the reason that happens, the reason we're labeled that way, is because the people who are profiting off of the inequality that exists are not threatened by the fact that we're handing blankets out to people who are homeless. When we start asking, why are people homeless? Then they start feeling threatened. When we say, well, why is there poverty? Then they start feeling threatened, And there's that famous quote, I think it goes something like, I feed the homeless, I feed the poor and they call me a saint. I ask why people are poor and they call me a communist. And that's the sort of thing, that's that thing that we sort of have to work through. So again, both the mitigative and the transformative, but we can't let go of the transformative. So I'm going to stop there and happily hear your questions.
Mirai, you're muted.
Yes, thank you so much for an incredible talk, Paul. And it's not only food for thought, but actually you make us think, what are we doing? Are we doing something right? Are we doing something wrong? Are we trying to help? I mean, it takes a lot of thinking. And maybe I want to bring to the Egyptian context in terms of education as well. Because I work in the field of education, so we're aligned on that. Talking about the Egyptian context, you said, I mean, poverty is relative in one place to another. Yes, it exists here. We have a lot of public schools and that is serving children in poverty. But you have good news. I mean, that I might say that according to what you said in your book as well, that maybe you have used the equity literacy skills. Our minister announced yesterday that we're going, because as you know, the online situation is aggravating the gap and it makes it more difficult for the students in poverty. But the minister announced good news yesterday that he's going to post on the curriculum on 10 TV channels, 10 public TV channels, which makes it much easier. And at least this is the least common denominator that people are, they can afford. So we're moving from online to, because we realize, so I think maybe we can say that we recognize the problem and we're trying to work on the problem. And moving it to the civil society, because the Takatuf Association, where I work, works on that. I want to ask you a question. First of all, you made me feel a little bit happy that we are dealing with the problem at the root of the problem, that we're not fixing the people, but we are trying to fix the school, the environmental conditions where they work. We're attending to the healthcare, we're trying to upgrade the school itself. So this is what you were saying in a way. So I want your opinion about what you said might sound like a long-term solution. So the short-term solutions, would you consider fixing a school to be a short-term solution leading to the long-term solution, working with the teachers, working to try to fix the environment itself? And so I want your to pick your brain on that. And would this mean attending to the problem the way it won't be really structural because we're just an NGO, but would be, did it mean that you really succeeded to go beyond the grit and beyond the deficit approach and start to do that on the small level?
That's a really great question. So I think of maybe there is a continuum of what is transformative. When I work with teachers in an individual school, I talk a lot about their sphere of influence. What do you have control over? And one thing that's really hard is that they don't have control over the kinds of resources their students have at home. They can't afford to buy a car for every family so the family can visit the kids' school and all of that. So to me, the first level of transformation is, what is my sphere of influence? For some teachers at the start, that might just be their own classroom. It might just be it might be a school. It might be more at an institutional level, an institution within society. And I think that's fine. If that is my role, then my role is, how do I change what I'm doing to be as just and equitable as possible? Because I can't, in my role as a teacher, I can't necessarily control all of the other things. While they're doing that, we need other people who are working more at the bigger structural level, because I don't think that we can, without addressing the barriers that people experience outside of schools and the barriers that public schools often experience in terms of their own funding and the resources that they have access to. We're not going to completely eliminate all of that without addressing the bigger sorts of things. But I think for people who are suffering right now, what can we do? So we need to be doing all of them at the same time. The problem is generally we're not doing all of them at the same time. We're maybe only working at the institutional level and not addressing the underlying concerns. So something could be transformative within my sphere of influence. Here's what I have control over. How can I be transformative in that context? Yeah.
So thank you for the answer. It's very encouraging, and that you are on the right track in a way. The chat is...
I did see a really interesting question in the chat that I would love to respond to. Is it okay if I just read it and respond to it? So the question is, do you think it's subjective whether working hard enough gets you what you want or not? And do you think it would be the same if the person who claims that working hard can get you somewhere was said by someone who used to be poor? Well, there's this concept in kind of the equity and social justice world. The concept is it's called the danger of a single story. And the danger of that is we take an example, which is an exception to the rule, and talk about that as though it is the rule. And this does often happen where somebody, often in my work, the people who have the most intense deficit views are the people who themselves experienced poverty, ended up coming out of poverty, and now they realize, well, the best benefit to me is to associate up the power continuum, not down the power continuum. So the best thing for me is just to buy into to buy into these notions that were once oppressive to me. So I don't doubt anybody's individual story, but I think, again, the problem is that question of hard work. It's not a question of hard work. Otherwise, what about all the people who worked just as hard as that person and didn't come out of poverty? What is your explanation for that? And the problem is that is the majority. The majority is people experiencing poverty, working hard their whole lives, doing all the right things, and dying in poverty. That is way more common than somebody being born into poverty, working hard, doing all the right things, and dying as a middle-class person or a wealthier person. So I don't deny someone's individual experience, but I challenge somebody using their individual experience to suggest some sort of pattern that we know by every bit of evidence doesn't actually exist.
Okay. Kariman, I have a problem. I can't see the questions on my chat. Can you just...
Kariman, a lot of the questions were posted privately. I think people didn't realize they were doing that. So I might be...
okay, that's why.
They all have the word privately next to them in red. Can
you see them, Kariman?
No,
no, I can't. So obviously you have the question. You can pick and choose whatever you want to answer.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for being the moderator as well, Paul. Really appreciate
so there's another question that says, as a regular citizen with no power at all, how can I help and sustainably fight poverty? Well, I think one thing we could do is just educational, is just give people a different window or a different understanding of poverty. So anytime somebody says, oh, those people are just lazy, that's another weird thing I find, a word that's used for people experiencing poverty. Again, people who are doing the most labor-intensive jobs, that often people refer to them as lazy. But even if it's just having conversations with your neighbors, that can help. I do think getting involved with any kind of local community organization that's working on these issues might also, be a way to get involved. So, living wage campaigns, affordable housing campaigns, those sorts of things. Someone else says, your article on racial equity is brilliant. Oh, thank you. I'm not sure which article. I think you might be talking about the Equity Detours article. My question is, what can I do to stop the existence of these ideologies in my sphere of influence as a university student? Oh, interesting. Again, I think you can, continue to educate yourself and then challenge people. I use a lot, I call them I wonder statements. I use a lot of statements where I'm trying to bridge people from a deficit view to a structural view. So somebody says, oh, well, parents from families experiencing poverty never show up to things we do at school. They just don't care about education. I might ask, well, I wonder if there's something that we're doing that's actually creating a lack of access for them. Maybe we need to rethink how we're structuring that sort of thing. So giving people just a different door or a window to look through, to look at things differently, and often I find when someone has a deficit view, it only takes me a couple of questions. I don't have to lecture or wag my finger at them or anything like that. But sometimes I just have to ask them a couple questions and it sort of blows up their ideology pretty quickly. Deficit ideology cannot, it does not stand up to any sort of critical analysis because it's just based on a very base level misunderstanding. So just, ask people questions, give people a different perspective. So this other question is, when we get someone hired and another ends up without a job, that this feels like kind of a loop, and how can we overcome it? Well, we overcome that by addressing the issues at their roots, which is, why aren't there jobs? Where is all the money going? How is wealth being distributed? When we get at those underlying issues, I know in the US, there's a real push to pass what's called a living wage law that requires people to pay a certain amount, because we know that's how much people need to be paid in a full-time job to not be in poverty. And of course, that might take a little bit of the profits out of the people who are used to getting most of the money back. But this is an inhumane way to arrange society. So if we address those underlying issues that are inhumane, that's how we solve that problem. Another question is, from your experience, what is the real reason pushing and or keeping generations in poverty? Well, I think the issue is an unfair distribution of access, opportunity, resources, and that sort of thing. And it's sort of the disadvantage compiles onto itself. So if I'm born into poverty, I'm probably born into a context where there's very little opportunity for advancement, where the schools probably aren't as good as schools that other people might attend, where the healthcare and social services probably aren't as good. And so it just sort of compounds and compounds and compounds and compounds and that sort of thing. So I think the problem is that, again, that we never get around to addressing those underlying issues. And if we see people who had once experienced poverty now doing well and being successful and all of that sort of thing, if we see that as evidence of anything, then it's evidence of the waste that we are allowing to happen, that the people who are experiencing poverty have just as much potential as anyone else They just don't have the same access and opportunity. They just are denied the kind of opportunity as children that children from wealthier families have. I mean, that is a fundamentally unjust society when that happens. And unfortunately, that's pretty much every society. So it is now 2 o'clock, so I feel like I have to cut myself off, and maybe we need to wrap up the conversation. But feel free to email me if you have any other questions. I'm happy to continue to engage.
Thank you very much, Paul, for a very enlightening presentation, and the talk was very interesting, and I'm sure you're going to receive a lot of emails. Already received everything privately, so I'm sure they're going to continue, and I think it's really food for thoughts about the poverty ideology, the key questions, not to ignore the cause of poverty and the gaps in access and opportunities. And I hope we will all think about all of that and to be on the right track to eliminate as much as we can. I know that you said that free education and is thought to be an equalizer, but it's not really. But if we're trying to work a little bit mitigation along transformation, maybe it will be an equalizer. Thank you so much, Paul, for your time.
Thank you all.
Kariman, back to you.
Thank you so much, Mirai. Thank you, Paul, for such an insightful discussion. We learned a lot, and me, myself, I have some questions. I will email them to you. So, yeah. And thank you, everyone, for your great contribution. And allow me to invite you next week to the coming webinar session. It's about corporate activism. What happens when a corporate take a political stand? So thank you so much, and see you next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Kariman. Thank you. Bye-bye.